Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we return to the woods to encounter the elusive Bigfoot. I'd also like to give a thank you to author Jordan Tyler Quinn Farkas for allowing us to narrate his Bigfoot experience, which is the third story. If you like his style of writing and are interested in reading more of his stories and encounters, all true mind you, you can find the link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, Harry, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpacking trip, just the 2 of us. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up until that point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car, and seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. My boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones, machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise is to not startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on them. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound backpack makes it difficult to make conversation. We were an hour in, and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent save for the rushing stream that was to the left of our trail. Silent woods are never a good sign, as this usually indicates a predator nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes we hadn't said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the time, and gave each other glances of knowing. I came over the top of the hill, and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me in the middle of the trail was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and started flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get his attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting on all fours, not looking away from us once. My husband quickly swung me around so that I was behind him and started yelling. Being in the military, he knows how to yell. The grizzly wasn't quite fazed as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. The bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, as he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. My husband said, "It's probably just some falling branches." We both knew this wasn't the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment, my husband stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we're not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large, dark mass, black brownish. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly that we had seen just moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point it was probably stupid to run, but that is exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point I was a mess. My husband was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're gonna be okay. I'm sure this won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not another hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we'd sat down, I noticed bushes moving in line towards the clearing towards us. Out of the bushes comes this adolescent grizzly, who looks just as spooked as I'm sure we did. But he came straight for us. My husband, being this crazy nut, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick and the bear ran off. All I could think of was just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened on the second night. Before we began our backpack, we had to let the ranger station know which trails and routes we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpack to check on you to make sure everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on these trails, we had been the sole hikers, and we didn't see another person once we were en route. Anyhow, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We'd been following hoofprints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my bootlace and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or two of daylight left, and in the woods it gets dark fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and my husband was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine for some reason wouldn't even turn on. We needed to find somewhere to set camp up, and we needed to eat. It was freezing, and the wind was blowing, creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear my husband or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be about 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being about 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked out he was until we'd left. There was no moonlight, so all the illumination we had was from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead or fallen just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing music out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sound. He also thought it would ward off any nearby predators. This is where we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. It was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Were they falling trees? There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. There was a thud. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing, definitely, not a falling tree. There was another thud. It came from right outside our tent. We both stopped breathing. His hands found mine, and we clung to each other paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. Shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps, but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inwards. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside, so I flashed my flashlight at that side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was in the shape of a human face, pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. My husband said screw that, pulled out a Glock from his sleeping bag, cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back and we heard fast footsteps heading towards the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent until the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals we had left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife is not the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. This happened somewhere around the mid-2000s when I was in middle school. I was staying at a friend's house for the night in the backwoods of Michigan. Immediately behind my friend Jay's house were a few acres of woods that led to a lake. If you went straight back into the woods from his backyard, there was a path that went straight to the lake, which was intersected at 90 degrees by another path about halfway to it, probably a quarter of a mile from the backyard to the lake. If you went straight down the path from the backyard that turned left at the intersection, the path was a downhill grade followed by a flat portion, followed by an uphill grade, which eventually ran into a 2-lane country road. One of those 55-mile-per-hour ones that goes on for miles, with not so much, but 1 or 2 houses. It was late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to set. We, being middle school boys, were running around the woods all afternoon, playing with fake weapons and stuff. Good times. Absolutely nothing leading up to this point was strange. No weird, eerie feelings, no odd, unidentified sounds, no paranoia or ghost stories prior to playing in the woods. Just 2 bros running around having a great time. We were basically pretending to be army guys. At one point, Jay decided to run off, saying something about flanking the enemy. He dashes off to my left. I started creeping through the woods, pretending to get bad guys as I went. I found myself standing at the intersection described earlier. Straight forward was the lake. To the left was the path that went down, then back up to the road. I was standing looking diagonally between the 2 paths when I hear some faint sound slightly off to my right towards the lake. What I saw made my whole body tingle in the worst possible way. About 50 feet, maybe more, maybe less, towards the lake and just behind a tree, I see this face and shoulder peeking around it. The most terrifying part was that it was probably 2 feet or more higher than you'd expect a human's head to be. Before I could probably observe the face, which was undoubtedly hairy, it snapped back from behind the tree as it realized I could see it. The color of the figure I saw was light gray, like your average cement sidewalk. Because of that, I was unsure of what it was. My first few thoughts were sheer confusion and fear. Then in my frozen state, I remembered that Jay was wearing a shirt almost exactly that shade of grey. I tried whisper shouting his name, Jay, towards the now hidden figure. I called out maybe 2 or 3 times, went off about 50 feet behind me and to my left. Down the path leading towards the road, Jay emerged from the thicker trees. This was the complete opposite direction from the figure I saw, and there's no way he could have snuck around me in that short time frame. To further drive the point home, It was fall, and the ground was covered in layers of dry, dead, deciduous leaves. The crunch from the leaves was very distinct and could not be avoided. Jay had heard me call out, and from just down the slight decline, he looked up and asked what was going on. I pointed off into the trees where I had seen the figure and said in a normal voice, "I saw something big over there." As soon as I finished that sentence, I mean, the very second, whatever I had seen started stomping off towards the road, parallel to the path we were on, but probably 50 to 100 feet deeper into the woods. Woods which were too thick to see anything at that distance. For some godforsaken reason, we tried to run after it. Jay and I were athletic as 6th or 7th graders could be. We played tons of sports and were quite fast. We were hauling ass down the path parallel to the beast, as fast as we could sprint, and yet it was absolutely smoking us. The road, if I remember correctly, was a solid quarter-mile from the intersection of the two paths. We had maybe just finished running down the downhill portion when this monster was already at the road, and believe it or not, we could tell where it was from the crunching leaves, and you could hear its massive footsteps clear as day while running. When we realized it was getting to the road, we also realized a car was coming. I kid you not. As soon as the crunching leaves stopped and the thing stepped out onto the road, the car slammed its brakes and pounded on the horn. Its tires screeched for a solid 3 or 4 seconds at least. When the car finally stopped, we heard the leaves start crunching on the other side of the road, and the car slammed on the gas and peeled out of there like a bat out of hell. Keep in mind, we could only hear all of this. We didn't see the car, so there was no way we could ever track down the person to ask them what they saw. But I wouldn't be surprised if their story is out on the internet somewhere, about the time they almost turned Bigfoot into roadkill. We made our way to the road, crossed to the other side, and it was mostly flat woods as far as the eye could see. Nothing but trees, no sight nor sound of the beast. We waited for a bit and then went back home. A few things to note. Was it Bigfoot for sure? I can't say. But what I do know is that it was tall, hairy, grey, and 100% bipedal. There was absolutely no mistaking the sound of it running. It's funny though, there are descriptions and videos of Bigfoot walking and moving far faster than a normal human. But I'm almost sure this thing was sprinting. The speed at which it reached the road was utterly unbelievable. It ran a quarter of a mile in probably close to 20 seconds. And trust me, I understand how absurd that sounds. In the 1800s, as early Americans spread across the continent of North America, they began to encounter not only new and mysterious creatures, but also stories from Native Americans about these same entities. Some of these stories the natives told to the then newcomers dated back centuries, in some cases possibly even longer. Among these strange and bizarre stories that the natives shared with the early Americans were weird tales of giant men-like beasts covered in long hair. Sometimes they lived side by side with people. Other times they lived in caves or forests or mountains, hunting and eating humans like game. Some of the legends spoke of the giant hairy wild men, even eating each other as well. During the middle to late 1800s, stories began surfacing from just about every corner of the country, from the Great Pacific Northwest to the eastern woodlands, Great Lakes, and everything in between. Bigfoot has without a doubt been sighted all across the United States. Newspaper articles, letters from the time period, and all point to this reality. However real the phenomena may be, the name Bigfoot didn't accompany these tales in the beginning. The legendary nickname can be traced back to 2 specific Native American chiefs that lived in the 19th century and had the name of Bigfoot. Likewise, during the late 19th and early 20th century, there were 2 giant bears spotted roaming the Western American frontier. These massive animals were sighted so many times that the story was picked up by the media, and the bears were dubbed Bigfoot. These bears were apparently quite the sensation to the public at the time, and it stuck in the minds of the people well after the chiefs and bears had come and gone. The term Bigfoot began to apply also to this mysterious creature that we now know as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape, yeti, and more, from one side of the world to the other. That said, during the early 1800s, accounts from world-class explorers began to appear in the world news regarding these mysterious creatures with their tall frames, long dark hair, muscular bodies, and incredibly large feet. 1832, British explorer B.H. Hodgson is one of the first respected individuals to go on official records about the subject. Stated he witnessed one of the creatures in the wilderness of Nepal. At the same time, all across America, reports were flooding in of similar creature sightings. The world-class explorer and Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Waddell was one of the next to officially spot a Bigfoot, back in 1899. 26 years later, another Bigfoot is located in the Himalayas. 1937 marked one of the first Bigfoot sightings ever reported in the state of Indiana. During the summer in the Cypress Beach area of Boonville, Indiana, a Bigfoot is seen. This sighting is the first of a steady stream of reports from Indiana over the next 3/4 of a century. From 1948 to 1953, several explorers sought after Bigfoot. Several of these explorers captured photographs and prints reportedly made by the legendary creature, including Eric Shipton, Peter Bryan, and Sir Edmund Hillary. Mountaineer John Jackson also found and photographed prints of the Bigfoot. In addition to mere footprints, he also discovered primitive paintings which seemed to depict Bigfoot. According to rumors, 5 years later, in 1959, Bigfoot feces were collected and tested by interested parties as well. At least one of the parasites found in the stool sample is said to not be identified. The remains of more than likely the same stool were smuggled to London by then famous actor James Stewart. What became of these remains cannot be said. However, there is no question Stewart did indeed smuggle something he claimed to be the remains of a yeti to London in the year 1959. The following year, Edmund Hillary decides to make another expedition in attempts to track down the elusive creature once more. The expedition is led by Edmund and his team, but yielded nothing. It wouldn't be until several years later, in the late 60s, that the famous Patterson-Gimlin footage would be captured and shared with the public eye. This iconic video clearly shows what appears to be a large and muscular Bigfoot, with long dark hair, standing upright on 2 legs and moving through a wooded area. Anyone who researches the subject of Bigfoot has definitely seen this particular footage, as it's considered quite the classic at this point. It's been widely debated for many years. This video was credited with kicking off a resurgence in Bigfoot sightings across the country. It could also be argued that the sightings were happening the entire time, and people were just too embarrassed or ashamed to share them. In 1968, the very next year, a Bigfoot was spotted in Spencer County, Indiana. Many more sightings were to happen in the state of Indiana over the years to come. The Bigfoot Field Research Organization, or BFRO, has recorded 75 sightings in Indiana since the early 1970s. In addition, the Indiana Bigfoot Field Research Organization have also registered 91 unique sightings since the year 1973. I believe it's safe to say Indiana has had its fair share of sightings. During the summer of 2012, on the banks of the Yellow Lake in Morgan County, multiple reports of Bigfoot-like howls were reported coming off from the surrounding forest. That very same year in Sterling County, a police officer witnessed what he claimed appeared to be a Bigfoot standing at the edge of his yard. Safe to say, over time, there have been many different accounts from many independent witnesses. But my story? Well, in 2017 I was camping in one of Hoosier State's more extensive protected forests for several days. Typically when I'm backpacking, I'm used to looking for the wildest places with the least amount of people around. I like to enjoy nature, and greedily I love to have the trail to myself for the most part. That said, the area was selected due to its general isolation in comparison to the rest of the park's regular overnight campsites and much larger family-oriented campgrounds. However, it did allow for several other campers and horseback riders to camp in addition to just myself. On this particular trip, I was vamping on the second year in a row. I'd recently switched from using a Chevy Blazer for off-roading in the mountains to a Kia Sedona for cruising around in comfort, and was loving it. Vamping was something I'd always wanted to do, so I was doing it. The minivan was converted into a stealth camper with GPS, Wi-Fi, and all the supplies I needed for a few days at a time. The back seats were removed, a bed was installed, and I had plenty of storage for my gear. When I found a place I liked, I'd stop and go for a hike. If I liked the area, I'd hang out for a few days, and if I didn't, I'd head on down the road. It was in this manner that I found the area where I encountered the Bigfoot. I had tried out a couple of different camping sites in the forest that I found pretty ideal at first, but then somewhat lacking after just a bit of exploring, and these spots were too close to people for my liking. Just before this event happened, one of my younger brothers had accompanied me on a trip to the same region. Our trip had been a couple of days prior, and about 50 miles further south than the journey I am describing now. I mention this fact because it was on the earlier expedition with my brother Colt that I was studying maps of the area. I'd found a few places on the map that looked promising. Plenty of forest, several trails, and only a few residences, within a 45-minute drive from the nearest town. My kind of hiking and camping, more or less uninterrupted. After dropping Colt off in Louisville, Kentucky, I headed back across the Ohio River to Indiana and straight into the heart of the Hoosier National Forest. Once I got there, I plugged a few campsites into my GPS, cruised around for what turned out to be 4 hours, checking out 2 or 3 potential sites, and eventually I settled for one, knowing it would be dark soon and wanting to get out for a walk. That's just what I did. The first couple of days were quiet. There was absolutely no one around, and I took the time to get to know the trails. There were 2 main trails to choose from, each one of them as isolated as the next in regards to the majority of the park's major trail system. Also, it's worth mentioning that it was getting late in the season. Summer was turning into autumn, and the trails in the area were mainly for horses to begin. So when I say no one was there, I mean no one. I particularly enjoyed this aspect. From my camp, one of the trails headed north and slightly west. The other trail was a loop, leading into one of the deeper parts of this particular national forest. Furthermore, this loop is extremely excluded and has no other paths that cross it, period. I spent the better part of the first 2 days exploring these first, and it was quite enjoyable. It connected to the campground several hundred yards away from the looping horse trail. As I said, this loop doesn't interact with any other of the park's other trails, including this one. However, their trailheads are located within eyesight of each other if you're standing in the right place. I hiked down the first trail for what felt like several miles at the very least. I'm not exactly sure how far it was, because honestly I had no reason to be documenting anything. I was just enjoying myself and the beauty of the forest. The trail ran through a heavily forested area with the park. It had slight ups and downs to the terrain, meaning it wasn't flat but definitely not mountainous either. Hilly would be the perfect word for it. Anyhow, when Friday rolled around, the weather was really lovely, and several people showed up with trucks and trailers to go horseback riding. That's when I moved to the most remote corner of the campground because I don't like crowds. Besides, I'd already explored the other trails over the previous few days, so I let the horseback riders have the trails for the weekend. At some point that same afternoon, I ran to the nearest town with my camper van to pick up some supplies for the weekend. It was then, while I was driving down that little windy country road that led to the nearest Keydink store within a 45-minute drive from the camp, that I saw it. I will never forget that moment. I was multitasking, and that seems to help me remember things better. I had come around the corner and I was watching the road and talking to my wife over the phone. I was checking my mirrors, the rear view and the left driver's side, when I noticed something moving on the hillside that I was driving by. It had been a few days since I saw any animals, so I was eager to see what it was. The hill was open wide for probably about 50 to 100 yards until reaching the trees. Standing just outside of the trees was what I can only describe as a Sasquatch. It was approximately 50 yards from me, and it was extremely tall and muscular, and covered in long dark hair. It was huge, just like the stories I'd heard, but not bulky like a gorilla, more like an extremely tall and well-built man. I would guess the thing weighed no less than 300 pounds of solid muscle. I did a double take over my shoulder as I drove by, and the image was burnt into my memory forever. I remember my brain trying to rationalize that it couldn't be real. That said, I mentioned to my wife that someone had placed a hell of a lifelike statue on that side of the hill, a hill in the middle of nowhere. As I'm telling her this, I realized just how ridiculous that sounds. At the time, my brain was still trying to make myself believe that it was some sort of statue and not a real Bigfoot, but at the same time I was also recalling how its hair was blowing in the wind, and how its incredible muscles were bulging like that of a bodybuilder. I was in total shock. Spending as much time in nature as I do, it wouldn't take much to start to believe these legends are nothing more than stories. I mean, I've spent days, as much as weeks at a time in the wild. Sure, I've seen some crazy things, but regardless of that fact, seeing a Bigfoot was not something you're expecting to see or can possibly prepare yourself for. I continued on to the store, collected my supplies without wrecking my van, and when I made it back to camp a few hours later, I tried to forget about the event again and carry on with my day. However, it wasn't able to escape my mind so quickly. I decided to go exploring instead, to try and wrap my head around what actually happened. Starting with the loop trail that I had yet to entirely hike, I walked down the path for about 45 minutes. I followed the trail until I found a dry creek bed that I gladly decided to pursue. You see, I enjoy hiking along dry creek beds, as I'm fully aware these were the old trails and highways, so to speak, of the ancient people. They didn't use paved roads like we do, so they followed rivers, streams, and game trails. Over the years, I found arrowheads, primitive tools, and all kinds of artifacts in this manner. Anyhow, I was walking down the creek for roughly 2 miles or so. I was actively looking for patches of fur, and any sign of a trail. Anything that may indicate something as big or even larger than a human traveling through the area. I did find a few curious trails, but they soon disappeared due to the rocky surface. Other than a few rocks that could have been primitive tools, I didn't see anything else that interested me, besides the few ghost trails I'd found. Eventually I lost interest. Feeling defeated, I turned back and made the hour's hike back to the creek bed, down to the trail, and back towards camp. When I finally got back to the beginning of the trailhead and started crossing the campground towards my van, I noticed a buck step out of the woods in the opposite side of the forest. It was the first living creature I had seen aside from on the drive. The deer stepped onto the gravel road that circled around the campground and stared directly at me. I looked back at it, and we both just stood there staring at each other. After what seemed like a few minutes, but was probably nothing more than mere seconds, the deer turned its head back towards the woods that it had just come from, and walked off, vanishing into the trees. I continued on my back to my campsite, feeling strangely odd about the encounter. The next day I didn't really feel much like hiking, so I piddled around camp for a bit, for a change. I had a campfire, carved a bit, sipped some strong coffee and had a meal, and decided to take a rest at some point, partially due to boredom, and also partially due to feeling strangely let down from the day before. So I climbed inside the van to stretch it out. I was laying there for a moment, thinking about how many nuts must have fallen out of this tree and hit the van since I'd been there this weekend, when I realized that they weren't falling out of the tree at all. Rather, they were actually hitting the side of the van, and that something or someone must be throwing them. Shivers ran up and down my spine as I remembered what I had seen earlier that day on the hillside as I was driving to town for supplies. I sat up immediately, no longer feeling secure in the safety of my van. I was parked less than 50 feet away from the edge of the forest, and about the same from my fire pit. There was a rather large tree, some sort of oak, standing between the van and the fire pit. When I got out the van and stood up straight, a walnut or crab apple came flying out of the woods and smashed into the tree. It hit the tree trunk hard, that the thing bounced a good 25 feet off the tree's trunk and then rolled another 50 before coming to a full stop. I remember my first thought about the flying object impacting the tree was the speed and accuracy and power behind it. My second thought was that my face would have been just as easy for whatever it was to throw it to hit. Immediately I look all around me, but of course there was no one there. I also realized that at the time, while I was napping, the very last person camping other than myself had left the campground. I was the only human around here for miles. I was the only person actually camping the entire weekend to begin with. Everyone else who came into the area during the time of the story simply drove into the area, made their way around the loop and left. Alternatively, they came with a truck and trailer and went horseback riding. But now I was the only one here. The one person that significantly stood out among the rest of the crowd over the weekend was a man driving a golden van, much like mine, with blacked out tinted windows. He was playing loud classic rock and wearing dark sunglasses. This was the individual who had disappeared while I was napping. He was the last person to leave the campground that weekend other than me, and was the only other person who hadn't been horseback riding. He hadn't been hiking either. I don't actually know what he'd been doing other than parking directly across from me and listening to loud music since shortly after my Bigfoot sighting. When I stepped out the van, and that thing smashed into the tree, I quickly realized that I was alone with this thing. I also rationalized rather swiftly that this thing had waited for the right moment to get my attention. As crazy as it seemed, or more appropriately, they had waited until every last truck, trailer horse had left, before tossing rocks at my van windows. Now, I've never claimed to be the brightest crayon in the box, that's for sure, but this didn't take a genius to figure out. Or maybe it did. I'm mentally challenged, which is why I thought the correct thing to do would be to run straight into the woods, the same direction the rocks and walnuts had come from, and search for who or what had thrown them. I've never shielded away from unusual experiences, quite the opposite. I saw this as a unique opportunity. I wanted to get to the bottom of what the hell was going on around there. Was it all somehow an elaborate hoax? I don't know, but I'm sure planning on finding out. I charged into the nearest section of foods to my camp, like a moron carrying a 5-foot staff, as it would do anything to a Bigfoot. Thankfully for me, but to my utter dismay, there was nothing to be seen in the forest's edge. I stood there listening and waiting, but never heard a peep from anything but creaking trees. In hindsight, and in 100% honesty, it never occurred to me what I might have seen if I'd have just looked up into the treetops. But it wasn't meant to be, because the thought didn't cross my mind. Instead, I swung my head from side to side, scanning every tree trunk, branch, and rock and log in sight for the nearest bit of movement. Heart beating, with nothing showing, I walked around the edge of the woods a bit more and then headed back to camp, bewildered. No one else showed up to the campground that night, and I never heard anything else that night either. However, what happened the very next morning is actually the most interesting part of the story. On my last morning at the Hoosier National Forest, I was sitting on my campfire sipping on some hot coffee trying to wake up. I always carry an old-fashioned percolator to make campfire coffee. I had been awake for about half hour when I begin to hear a car engine, I think about several miles away. The sun was just starting to come up, meaning it was around 6 to 7 a.m. I stood up from my fire and was stretching out when I noticed the sound of the car continuing to get closer. At this point, it must have been hardly a mile or two from camp. This is when things got weird. As I mentioned before, I was parked very close to the woodline. The main trail that I'd been hiking on was no less than 20 feet away from where I laid my head in the van to sleep, which is something I usually never do. Sleep so close to a public trail, as you never know who or what might come down the trail to catch you napping. Believe me, I've heard horror stories about people disappearing from nature parks. The amount of missing people in the United States is in the tens of thousands at any given time. Many of these cases involve national and state parks, but that is for another time. The reason I take the time to explain this is because of what happened next. If I hadn't been standing on the edge of the woods practically inside it, I doubt I'd have been able to hear what I did. Fate would have it that what happened next, I not only heard, but I heard it so vividly it haunts me to this day. The car came nearer to our location, and two distinct noises began almost simultaneously. Within a split second, a third noise added to this strange symphony of sounds, not so softly blowing my unbelieving mind. The first sound was not so strange as it was frightening. A half yell, half scream. It sounded like every person who's ever claimed to have heard a Bigfoot say what it sounded like. Something between man and animal, something not human but not creature either. Something more. Whatever it was, didn't sound happy. I was entirely beside myself, as if I were dreaming for a moment due to the bizarre nature of the entire trip, but I soon snapped back to myself. Several large branches began to break from several directions out in the forest, barely beyond my parked van. When I say large branches, I mean massive, because I could hear them snapping from great distances as they steadily moved further into the depths of the forest. Some of these noises were much nearer than others, but many of them sounded like they were on the other side of the most adjacent hill surrounding camp. As I stood there, the sound of the branches breaking ascended the nearest hill and then promptly descended on the opposite side, obviously going in the same direction. The exact direction of the screams or calls. My mind was blown again. Had this thing just summoned the others within those 3 horrifying shouts? It sure looked like it. If I had to guess, each branch that was broke was located somewhere from the middle to the top of the trees. None of them were low branches. And we're not talking about small trees here. This incident was in a national forest, which is federally protected and has some rather old trees specifically in this part. They have larger roots and have lots of thick upper branches. I would also guess that the distance between each sound of breaking branches was probably 10 to 20 yards, but it's impossible for me to gauge. However, I've spent years in the wilderness, and anyone who knows me will tell you that my judgment of time and distance is usually quite on the mark. No doubt whatever it was, it must have been rather large, strong, and agile, not to mention several of them out there. And not only that, I realized with dread, but apparently a number of things had been out there in the woods extremely close to my campsite, surrounding it on 2 sides. I was completely unaware until the car came down the road. Had they been there the entire night? Had they followed back from the day before when I'd spent a few hours searching the forest for signs of them? I was chilled to the bone. I listened to the receding tree branches snapping with the force of whatever was swinging, jumping, or otherwise moving from tree to tree. Whatever they were moving extremely quickly. It couldn't have taken them more than a few seconds to cover an entire hill that would have taken a man several minutes to walk up. I mean, literally 10 to 15 seconds tops. And whatever was moving out there through the trees was gone from the edge of my campsite and entirely out of my hearing range. I'm aware these events may not seem alarming. However, if you were there, you'd without a doubt understand exactly how unnerving a situation like this can be. Likewise, if you've ever encountered something similar, you can imagine how terrifying yet intriguing these sort of things can be. I purposefully neglected to mention one of the most critical aspects of that morning's happening, and in fact, to be perfectly honest, the branches of the trees breaking was, in my opinion, a direct response to what I'm about to explain. That morning, as I had stood stretching with coffee cup in hand, when I heard the car coming, the insanely creepy 3 howling screams, and the breaking branches, I'd listened to an additional sound as well. A drum. You heard that right. As clear as day, what sounded, by all means, to be a large drum beating in the distance. It rang out several times, spaced smoothly in an even rhythm. The drum beat in the distance, yet it was close enough that I could plainly hear it, low and powerful. If you've ever had the pleasure of attending a Native American powwow or visiting an authentic drumming circle, you would know that it's hard to mistake a tribal-sounding drumbeat, and that's precisely what I'd heard. The moment the car was within a quarter of a mile from the campground, the drum abruptly stopped. The branch breaking had ended as well. As bizarre of a situation as it was, and genuinely surreal in any event, what was happening somehow made perfect sense to me. These things that had been lurking at the edges of my camp for whatever reason sounded an alarm at the oncoming vehicle, to which they all retreated together. All of those branches breaking, moving away in the same direction of the drum and the 3 howls. There was more than one of them. I'd say at least 3, but more likely closer to 4 or 5. What I can say for sure is that they were moving incredibly fast and sounded large. I don't know of any other animal in this part of the country that's capable of breaking branches like that, even more, covering the amount of distance in such a short amount of time. And don't get me started on the drum, because I would honestly really love nothing more than to know what the hell it was all about. I know what I saw during the trip to the Hoosier National Forest, and I know what I experienced. That's all there is to it. If I were a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or some other type of being besides a human living in the world, I would probably want my privacy too. I mean, come on, it's not like us humans have such a good track record of sharing or being great friends to the environment, let alone each other. I'll be the first to admit I have no idea what Bigfoot is. Popular theories propose that Bigfoot could be a alien race, a relative of the Neanderthal, or even creatures that walk between dimensions. I don't know what they are, but I know that they are real. This was just last year. I had moved from New York to Vermont and decided to rent a home for a few months that allowed my cat and dog, while I waited to close on my new home in Vermont. Last year it was particularly snowy, and this house was located up a small mountain off a dirt road. If 10 cars passed on the road during the day, that was a busy day. I thought it was closer to the village when I first booked it through Zillow, but I wasn't looking to go anywhere really, but to instead heal, rest up, and relax from what already had been an exhausting ordeal and moving experience. I had some guy friends who would help me get up there, and they left after one night. I was told not to let my dog run without a leash, as there were a few alpacas at the next door farm who may attack my dog, which was at least 1/8 of a mile walking distance away. Not that my aging dog was going anywhere too quickly. He was 17 at the time and could barely walk anymore. He was one of those awesome, really great dogs you may be lucky to have once or twice in your life. Got along with everything and anyone. The next door neighbor, after that, was at least a mile down the road. As I settled into this lovely, one-story home, the house had automated motion detectors that would light up the driveway that ran behind the house. There stood a huge ancient apple tree that still had some apples on it, way high up, even in March, and your usual pine and birch trees surrounding the property. The large front and back lawn areas, being several acres in size, are surrounded by forests and old rock walls. I grew up in an area in New York where I was surrounded by trees and forests, so I wasn't spooked until the second night. The house had a large pond out front which was covered in ice and snow. There was literally at least 4 feet of snow on the ground, with just enough of the driveway plowed to get your car in and out. I backed my car by the back door, and there were several outbuildings too on the property. One building in particular was perhaps 30 feet from the back door of the house, that you could go through the kitchen to get to. In this open garage-like building, it looked to be used like a large garden storage area. There were no doors, just an open area. Off the kitchen was a screened-in porch that faced the pond out front. So, on the second night I take my dog, put him on the leash, it's 8 p.m, and pitch black outside. Fresh, fluffy snow of about 1 foot has fallen, and me being a silly New Yorker with just sneakers without any socks, in my nightgown and a light jacket. I walk out the back door with my dog in tow, thinking I'd only be out for a few minutes. I walk him slowly to do his business, as I was soon readying to get to bed. As I returned to the door, I soon realized I had inadvertently locked myself out of the house. Oh no. It was one of those types of doorknobs that you twist in one direction, and it will lock itself. I tried not to panic, but it was cold, and there I am looking silly, and thought perhaps, well, I could walk to the neighbor's house. But I had no flashlight, no cell phone, and felt I would break an ankle trying to manage to walk in the dark. That's when I remembered I saw something in the open garage-like building. It was a crowbar. I thought I could do one of those MacGyver moves. I've seen enough window break-ins on TV, and went to take my dog's leash and tie it around my car's left mirror. I knew I would only be losing my deposit at this point, and I'd have to pay for the damage, but heck, I'm stuck outside with no key and freezing temperatures, without any way of even getting into my car to stay in the night with the dog. I go grab the crowbar, and with little hesitancy, and then with full vigor, I took said crowbar facing away, swung it at the glass as hard as I could. It bounced off, making the loudest sound that just echoed in the night, and it even sparked. Now, first of all, what kind of window doesn't break? Mind you, I'm a strong gal, but this was like bulletproof glass on safety glass. Then I thought, well, since perhaps it's a safety feature, let me try another window. I chose another one to the left after surveying it. I could probably get to climb in, and again, same issue. I was like, forget this. There has to be another solution. That's when I remembered the screened-in porch that's off the kitchen, and I thought, well, perhaps I could get to the screen porch door that leads outside, and if the door to the kitchen was still unlocked, well, I'd only have to pay for the ripped screen. Much easier than to repair a broken window. So I go, and there's at least a 15-inch path of snow that must be cleared for me to even access that screen door. So I go to the garage and grab the shovel I saw earlier, my hands and legs getting colder with every moment, and I start to clear the snow, shoveling as quickly as I can. At the time, my dog is barking because he can't see me around the corner. His barks echo off the back of the mountain that's beyond the forest in the backyard. I keep yelling at him to quieten down. When I no longer hear him, I don't think about it too much because I have to get inside and figured he'd just calm down. Finally, I reach the screen door and I'm super grateful it's unlocked. I squeeze my way through, pushing more snow out the way, and make my way to access the kitchen door, hoping all the while I haven't locked it. And, to my relief, it's unlocked. I run through the kitchen, go out the back door to the door from which I got locked out of to grab my dog, not without grabbing my keys this time. I look at the mirror of the car, and my dog's not there. His leash just hangs there, and it looks like it's been torn. I start to freak out, like I need any more troubles tonight. I start to walk around the back of the house, and there's my old dog, happily having done his business, just wadding his way back to me. I am one very relieved chick. I tie the leash into a knot so that I can use it the next day. It's one of those retractable leashes made for dogs that are over 100 pounds and is at least an inch wide. How he tore or chewed through it that quickly, I often wonder. Finally, I get to bed and vow to never leave the house without keys in my hand. The next night is when Bigfoot decides to tell me they're in the neighborhood. I go out again at 8 p.m. It's a clear night, and I'm staring up at the stars in disbelief at how pretty it all is. I'm seeing constellations I've never seen after years of living in New York. I'm standing at the back of the house in front of a large picture window that looks out towards the backyard and mountain, with an open garage at my 3 o'clock position to my right. I was only there for a minute or two when I heard the first knock, and the 2 o'clock position and another one coming from the 11 o'clock position from where I'm standing. They were single, very clear knock noises, very much just like the ones I had made the night before while trying to get back into the house by trying to break back into the house through the windows. When I heard the noise, they were very distinctive. I know the sounds that trees make when they sway. This wasn't trees swaying. In fact, it was no wind at all that night. You know, I hightailed it back inside the house in seconds flat, and I locked the door. Next night, I'm thinking it's okay. But what would happen next scared me to bits. I'm doing the usual routine of walking the dog just down the driveway. I've now learned where the lights are for the outside, so I make sure they are all on. It's icy and I'm using a ski pole to help me walk safely with a flashlight. The house keys are in my jacket pocket while I walk the dog for his last evening walk. As I start to return to the back kitchen door, I look beyond the open garage out building, because a pop of color caught my eye. That's when I saw a pair of really large red eyes looking back at me at the edge of where the yard ends, with a rock wall abutting the forest. Perhaps an owl, I think, as I continue to look. I move and shift my body left to right, thinking it must be a reflector, something that's catching the lights. I would be good with an explanation, but no. It was eyes. Big red eyes staring straight and watching me. What got me most was how wide apart they are. They were about 100 to 120 feet from where I was standing. They looked at least 10 inches apart. I didn't even want to imagine how big whatever it was that was looking at me could be. I stood there for at least a minute because I was waiting for it to move, until I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at, so I scurried back into the house. The next day I went out and looked again at that area from which I saw eyes looking back at me. Looked carefully, even venturing out into the deep snow for about 30 feet to see if perhaps it was something like reflectors or tin cans. I even retrieved the binoculars, came back out, and I couldn't see anything except for the rock wall, forest, and the sounds of birds chirping happily. As I stayed there for 3 or 4 more weeks, I never saw those eyes or whatever was reflecting again. This isn't my first experience with a possible Bigfoot. as I have 2 others, but these happened in New York. But yes, people, there are odd things up in the mountains in Chester, Vermont, and it wasn't a mountain lion, nor wolf, nor coyote. But to hear that knocking, and then those big red glowing eyes the next day, I kept my night walking the dog very short after that, and I never left the house after dark for any other reason. I can assure you I felt like I was being watched several times after those first few nights. I didn't fear anything, but it was more like they were curious and watching out. The kicker? There was a key hanging right above the shovel I grabbed that first night that would have gained my access back into the house immediately. And yes, I got my entire security deposit back. I adored that house, by the way. And I haven't shared this story much, but my MacGyver days are over, that's for sure. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's Bigfoot experiences. I thought these were probably some of the best ones I've read on the channel so far. And if you'll agree with me, don't forget to be generous and leave a like. As always, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons for their continued support and contributions. It really does mean a lot. If you're interested in receiving some prizes for signing up, the link is in the description. Thank you guys. Now, I would like to carry on with this kind of nature-y topic that we have going on, but between you and me, I'm almost completely out of this topic of stories. I have one other topic, but looking at my story, it really doesn't look like it's going to happen unless I get some more permissions for tomorrow, which I don't know. It's unlikely. I've got 9 out of 10, but they're just a wee bit too short. If we get a few more, then yeah, it will happen, but if not, sadly no. I've got 8 out of 10 on cabin stories. If anyone's got a cabin story, something that's happened in a cabin in the woods, feel free to send it to me. Just get it in quick so that I can do it tomorrow to carry on the topic. They need to be quite long and well written though, mind you. So just keep that in mind if something crazy has happened to you in a cabin. Alright then guys. Well, I hope everyone is well during the quarantine, as fun as it is. And I hope the scary stories do help every night or whenever you listen. But for now, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.